Housing is a matter of livelihood. It is a matter of health. It is a matter of the life longevity. Ensuring stable housing has to be a national priority. And a part of that means really considering the right to housing. So the CDC moratorium is a really good example of where public health and housing intertwine. And it is a pandemic mitigation strategy designed to keep people in their homes so that we can control the spread of COVID-19. And that is only effective if it's consistently interpreted across jurisdictions and if it's implemented uniformly and if it's enforced. And it also requires that tenants understand their rights because they are the only individuals who can trigger protection under the moratorium. Across the country, we're seeing varied interpretations of the moratorium itself from the courts, and as well as from property owners and their willingness to accept the declaration, and sheriffs on the end of the system who are charged with executing orders of eviction. And so in some jurisdictions, we have very protective courts who have determined that presenting a declaration of protection under the moratorium will stop the filing of the eviction itself. So keeping it off the record, keeping you out of the court system. Whereas in other jurisdictions, they'll allow the process to proceed all the way to the execution of the order and halting it right there, as opposed to earlier in the process, which gives you more time to collect rent relief, to avoid a judgment, to avoid that scarlet E on your record. And still, we also have judges in Georgia, for example, who have determined that the CDC moratorium, in their opinion, is unconstitutional, which contravenes higher level court decisions that have already decided the constitutionality of the CDC moratorium, that it is a necessary measure during the pandemic and that it is not infringing on any constitutional rights. And so the various interpretations of this order have led to this inconsistent implementation and really eroded the order itself and limited the effectiveness of the order and the moratorium in preventing the spread of COVID-19. I think first, as a country, we have to dedicate more funds to addressing the eviction crisis. It's estimated that tenants owe upwards of $100 billion in back rent, and we only have $25 billion earmarked for both rent and utility debt. So that $25 billion is only going to make a dent in the need. And how effective it is depends entirely on how committed states are to dispersing that fund, the funds that they receive in a deliberate and equitable way. Many of the states across the country did not have robust rental assistance or rent relief programs before the pandemic, so they are building them from scratch, which means that they don't have inroads into the communities that need them the most. And if they learned anything from the CARES Act and the CRF funding that was allocated and some of the failings of those programs where the bar was set too high and so they had excess funds that they'd never actually dispersed to the community, or the bar was set very low and they ran out of funding within hours, which is where we should be. We need to get that funding into the communities as quickly as possible to prevent the most harm. So a couple of the best practices for rental assistance programs, ensuring that the barrier to entry is very low, that there are not rigorous requirements for eligibility and proof of eligibility, that the bar doesn't create some sort of deterrent for people who are extremely marginalized or who might be undocumented, that these are some of the families and individuals who will be targeted the most and at the highest risk of extreme harm. So the low eligibility bar is the first step. And then the second is really identifying trusted community partners that the community works with already and that knows where to find the hardest hit renters and how to get the funds to them quickly. So that's a very critical component of this. We know where people are hardest hit. It's the same communities that have been ignored and overlooked for decades. And we know which ones those are. It's the communities with the lowest incomes, with the highest poverty rates, with the least amount of access to opportunity, and with the highest communities, the highest population of color. And so we can target our funds into those communities first to really build them back up and ensure that they're not at risk of displacement in the way that they are right now. We have an eviction system that, for just being a few days or a few dollars late on your rent, can result in severe poor health outcomes, even take years off of your life. It can cause adverse outcomes for pregnancy, low birth weight, early term pregnancies. It leads to increased violence for women. One eviction usually means that you will have multiple evictions and future housing precarity. So all of this, that harm, is due to this singular event of being caught up in that eviction system. And the system itself is being abused, and it is being used largely as a debt court, where landlords are using it to control behavior, to remind tenants to pay rent, even if they're just a day late, and that they'll file cases against them multiple times. So we have this serial filing phenomenon that ends up increasing rents for tenants and placing them at even further housing precarity. So this system itself has to be addressed, that so many of the solutions that we are placing on it right now are band-aids. The right to counsel is a response to the inequity in the system. The system itself is inequitable, so any of these solutions will not address that harm unless we take a look at the underlying issues. And a big part of that is this power imbalance. So the eviction, our landlord-tenant laws are descendants of feudal law, where tenants had no rights other than to pay the rent, and landlords enjoyed the ability to be free from tort immunity. They could rent to whoever they want. They could discriminate. They could engage in self-help eviction. They could provide uninhabitable units, and the tenant would accept that harm. Today, while we have had a revolution in landlord-tenant law and more protections for tenants, we have a long way to go. It's too easy to file an eviction case, and our eviction system, which was originally designed to allow the property owner to recoup the property, is now largely a debtor court. In almost every jurisdiction across the country, a landlord can file to evict for no reason. That at the end of your lease term, they only need to give you 30 days notice to evict you. And that is a mask for discrimination, for retaliation, and can really lead to a wide level of injustice. And we really need to start thinking about eviction prevention, diversion programs, just cause evictions, where there has to be a legitimate reason for evicting a tenant, and also clean hands policies, that you should not be allowed to evict a tenant from your unit if that unit is not habitable, if it does not comply with housing code and sanitation code. Ensuring stable housing has to be a national priority, and a part of that means really considering the right to housing. And this is not revolutionary. We have multiple countries who have a right to housing, where homelessness in Scotland, for example, is a phenomenon. It is something that doesn't happen very often. And when it does, it's rare and it's short in time duration. When I was working at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, so my first position out of law school, I worked with families who were living in homeless shelter. And I often think about one of the very first clients that I worked with. They come back to me all the time. It was a young mom, and 2 little kids. And they became homeless because they complained to the landlord about a hole in the roof. It was literally snowing and raining in their bedroom. And that retaliatory eviction led to them sleeping on the subway and sleeping outside and in cars and on people's floors. And they were sick. The kids were scared. They were really struggling. And every time I met with them, this little girl, the youngest, she would draw me pictures, often rainbows. She would hold my hand. One time she told me that she was my best friend in a little whisper. And so here are these kids who for no fault of their own, their life is completely just taken out from under their feet. And one of the last times that I met with them, this little girl looked at me and she asked, "Are you really going to help us?" It was too late to go after that landlord and protect them from this harm. I couldn't answer that question in that moment. And so I hear her voice every day. Are you really going to help us? And the answer has to be yes. Every time it has to be yes.